So how do we implement abstraction here? You want to hide certain members from the outside. So earlier you learned that this references that new circle object. Now what happens if I declare a local variable in this function? Let's say color, we set that to red. Is this going to be part of that object? Of course not, because we have not set that as a property on that object. We didn't set this.color to color, okay? So this is only a local variable inside of this function. When we get out of this function, this variable goes out of scope and dies. Now with this technique, we can easily hide certain members from the outside. So default location is implementation detail. We don't want this to be accessible from the outside. Instead of setting it as a property on our new object, we define it as a local variable here, okay? Now we don't need this color anymore. By the same token, we can convert this method to a private method. So let compute be a function. Now, here in the draw method, we're calling compute optimum location. This function will no longer be a method on this new object, so we can access it using this. We have to access it directly here. This will work because in JavaScript, we have this concept of closure. If you don't know closure, let me simplify it for you. So here we have one function and another function inside of that function. In this function, we can declare certain variables like x and y. And these are local variables that are only available in this function. Their scope is limited to this function. So when we finish executing this function, x and y will go out of scope. In contrast to scope, we have closure. A closure determines what variables will be accessible to an inner function. So this function will be able to access all the local variables defined here, as well as the variables defined in its parent function. So here we declared two variables, compute optimum location, which is a function, as well as default location. These are the variables that are defined in this parent function. They are within the scope of this function, but within the closure of this inner function. Now don't confuse closure with a scope, because the scope is temporary and it dies. So every time we call the draw method, these variables will be recreated and reinitialized. And then after this function, they will die. So scope is temporary, but closure stays there. So when we call the draw function, after we finish executing this function, these variables will continue to stay in memory. They will preserve their state because they're part of the closure of this draw function. Okay, so back here. So in this method, if you want to access those private members, you simply use them here. You can also use default location. But if you want to access members of this new circle object, you need to use this. So this.radius as an example. Okay, now with this simple change, we basically replaced this with let. Let's see what happens. If we access the members of the circle object, we only see draw and radius. So the public interface of this object is simpler, is easier to work with, and this will also prevent issues later down the road.